Hey there, everyone, and welcome to Pour and Explore, a wine, food, and travel podcast. I'm your host, Nick Elliott, the wine guy. I'd love to be your go-to guide for all things wine, food, and the amazing places they take us. Here on Pour and Explore, we'll sip, savor, and wander through the exciting world of wine, discuss incredible cuisines, and uncover the stories behind unforgettable destinations. Each week, I'll bring you lively conversations with wine experts, chefs, travel pros, and fellow enthusiasts. We'll share practical tips, hilarious tales, and plenty of inspiration to fuel your next adventure. So grab a glass, pull up a chair, and join me as we pour, explore, and celebrate the good life. Let's dive in. Hey to all of my wine lovers and curious travelers. Welcome back to Pour and Explore. I'm your host, Nick Elliott. I will be your guide through the world of wine, unforgettable travel, and the people who bring it all together. Now, one of my favorite things about doing this show is introducing you to places that you might never think to visit, or even knew existed. And the people that you definitely want to meet and their amazing stories. And today's guest checks both boxes in the best possible way. I'm joined today by Kara Hammes. She is an entrepreneur and a hospitality expert based in Brown County, Indiana. Yes, Brown County, Indiana, you heard me right, which, if you've never heard of it, is about to shoot to the top of your weekend getaway list. Let's start with the setting. Brown County is one of those rare Midwest spots that makes you feel like you've stepped into another world. It's hilly, it's wooded, it's artsy, and it's got this charming little town called Nashville. No, not that Nashville. This charming little town called Nashville, filled with cute shops, hiking trails, and, of course, wineries. This isn't your flat cornfield, Indiana, by any means. Brown County is more like a miniature Blue Ridge with a surprising wine scene to go along with its charm. And Kara, she is the vision behind the Barn Burner. This is a group-friendly Airbnb property and event space that feels like a cross between a boutique inn and your coolest friend's farmhouse. It's got 4 units, 9 bedrooms, and space for up to 29 guests. It is the kind of place you book when you're planning a family reunion, bachelorette weekend, maybe a creative retreat, and you want it to feel like home, but cooler. In this episode today, we're going to talk about how Kara and her family got into the world of hosting, what it takes to really run a successful Airbnb, and spoiler, it's not passive income, the thoughtful details that make guests feel seen and cared for, and how Brown County has grown into a laid-back wine lover's paradise. We're also going to geek out about things like blanket weights, emergency fan placement, and why it's so important to read the dang listing before you book. And if you're a wine lover thinking, Nick, is there actually good wine in Indiana? You're not alone. I asked the same question, but as Kara shares, the Brown County area is home to an up-and-coming wine scene with tasting rooms you can walk to, approachable pours, and even some locally grown grapes that make surprisingly solid red wines. We shout out to Brown County Winery and Range 46, 2 spots worth putting on your tasting trail if you ever make it up to that area. And here's what I love most about this conversation. Kara's approach to hospitality is rooted in care, not just clean sheets and check-in instructions. It's true hospitality. It's the kind where every guest feels welcome, thought of, and taken care of. That shows up in little things like making sure there's a fan in every room or that the blankets come in different weights. It shows how she teaches. It shows up in how she teaches her guests to contact her if something breaks, not just scold, but to help. And it shows up on how she encourages other would-be hosts to check their local regulations before diving in and to expect that real hospitality is an active job and not a hands-off side hustle. So, if you've ever thought about running a short term rental, traveling through the Midwest, or just want to hear how thoughtful and intentional design can transform a stay at an Airbnb or VRBO, any type of rental home, this episode is for you. So pour yourself something cozy, maybe a glass of fruit forward, wine coming from the Midwest, if you can get your hands on it, and sit back, relax, and let's head to the hills of Brown County with the wonderful Kara Hammis. Thank you.
All right. Gareth, thank you so much for being on the show. Welcome to Pour and Explore.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. I've been excited to talk with you. I haven't had a whole lot of travel going on in the podcast over the last few weeks, a little tidbit, but I really wanted to concentrate on travel and talking about all of the fun things you do at the top of the show. I talked about all the great things you're doing over there in Indiana. And let's start here. What makes Brown County such a hidden gem for travelers? Give us your hot take on what makes it so awesome.
Yeah. So we moved to Brown County in 2016, but I've been visiting here since I was a kid. We would come camping my whole childhood. So I've been here many times. And, we decided to move here because we loved it, but I've only come to love it more since moving down here. And if you're someone that has ever visited Indiana or the Midwest, you probably have a picture in your head of like what you're expecting. And it's probably cornfields and interstates and, a place you're trying to get through pretty quickly. But what is so unique about Brown County, just what you'll notice when you're very first driving here, is the topography. So it is extremely hilly compared to the rest of Indiana and wooded. I used to be the county extension educator, and so I had to have all these facts about like farming and agriculture and forestry here. But I think the most forested county in Indiana, and again, just really hilly. It has something to do with like ice age glaciers or something. I didn't grow up in Indiana, so I didn't learn this in elementary social studies, but the topography is just really different. It makes it beautiful. And then again, because of the topography, it's like the history, I think, back in the 1900s, it's like that Brown County was this little tucked away pocket outside of time because it was harder to get here. And that feeling kind of continues today. So the little small town, Nashville, is the only like incorporated town. And it just looks like, it could be the set of a Hallmark movie, stone shops and cobblestones and little, alleys and tucked away corners. So it's just very quaint because it's such a tourist destination with the state park. And again, the outdoor and nature and shopping, there's so much more here than the local population could support on its own. So, shopping and wineries, hiking, again, paddleboarding, mountain. It's one of the like premier mountain bike destinations in the Midwest. And so there's just something for everyone to do. It feels totally different than, you drive 30 minutes in either direction and you would never guess that this is what's kind of hidden here in South Central Indiana. So those are just some of the reasons that I love it and think anyone would love it that came to visit.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like an amazing destination for adventure travelers.
Yeah.
You've got the hiking and the biking and, just beautiful, lush scenery wherever you go. One of the big tenets of this show, I talk about a lot, is getting out and exploring. When it comes to travel, it doesn't matter if you're going to France, it doesn't matter if you're going to Paris, Texas, or Paris, France. Get out of your comfort zone and go explore. And, I did a little research before I started recording on, this beautiful place you live. And you're absolutely right. It's, just stunning views everywhere you look. It's absolutely amazing. And anyone who, lives anywhere in that general vicinity, it's very easy to get to, despite, what they thought 100 years ago.
Right. Yes.
With, covered wagons and so on. But it really is very easy to get to. So when they get to this beautiful destination in Indiana, you've got Nashville, and obviously they're going to need places to stay. So that is a great segue into talking about the Barn Burner.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about this amazing place that you've put together for folks to come, stay, relax, have events, and so on. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, we built the barn burner. It'll be 5 years this November that we've been hosting guests. So we had our construction all happened between March and November of 2020. So that was its own whole wild ride of a year. But at the barn burner, it has 4 units that we rent as Airbnbs. And one of the unique things about the barn burner is that we're specifically prioritize hosting larger groups and families. So groups that need the whole space, and it's got 9 bedrooms. We can sleep up to 29 people. So most of the groups we're hosting are large family groups or, small business retreats, maybe a yoga retreat, milestone celebrations, all of that. And then we've also got the event space in the same building that people can add on, or sometimes it's rented separately. Like, for example, this past weekend, there was a family group there for their second year in a row to celebrate Memorial Day. They didn't need the event space, so a group was hosting a bridal shower in the event space. So sometimes it is separate groups, but we just love it. It's located right in Nashville, and that makes it so nice because it's such a small, walkable town. You can get to almost anything you would want to do. It makes it easy, especially for large groups. You're not trying to coordinate, a 5-car caravan to get everywhere you need to go. And that's kind of what makes the barn burner so unique, and the groups we're really focused on serving well. But there's so many other Airbnbs in the area and hotels, and if you needed a smaller option or you preferred to be out in the woods instead of in town, there's options for everyone here. Camping, anything you might want, you can probably find.
That's absolutely fantastic. I come from a very similar background to what you're talking about for years here in Central California. Before I moved down to San Diego, I worked at our family business, which is a large ranch in California. There's a beautiful hacienda on the property and meeting space and wedding space and event space, and of course, rooms as well. So I remember a lot of the trials and tribulations that I would go through renting the space and just dealing with people. Do you have a couple of stories that you can tell us that stand out from some of your groups? Maybe a great story, maybe a not so great story you could share with us?
Yeah. I mean, I always caveat at the beginning, like, we really have been so lucky in the guests we've had in 5 years. I can count on one hand, less than 5 times where it's really been like, what are you people thinking? So we have been so lucky. People, despite it being big groups, which some people might worry could be an issue, like, we've just found that we've really had some of the best guests we could ask for. And like I said, have been really lucky. And so, I mean, sometimes it's little things, like maybe a week ago, we got there to clean and one of the armchairs was broken. And I use all like vintage and antique furniture. So normally it's pretty sturdy, but they've also like lived a life and things break. And I'm pretty, as a host, understanding of that. I think that's just part of the business. Wine glasses get broken, a blanket gets a stain, whatever. I'm not a host that's really like nickel and diming guests on that. But I do think if you're someone who's a guest listening, like, tell the host, I'm going to find out that the chair broke, but now I'm scrambling to fix it before the next group checks in. Where if you could have told me, one, maybe I could have fixed it while you were there and then you would have had the use of the chair, or I could have at least like had parts ready to go. So little things like that sometimes just make me roll my eyes, because it's like, I'm going to find out. You've only made annoyed and in more of a rush. So again, that hasn't even happened often, but that's probably the most like common type of issue that we would encounter. We did last fall have one that was like off the charts, kind of awful. I feel like I'm still like coming to terms with that day where we were hosting a group. It was like a kids, I think it was an FFA group or something that was going to the national conference in Indianapolis. So it was like high school kids and their chaperones. And in one of the units, they had stored food on top of the stove essentially and bumped a burner when they were leaving for the day. And it caught like Cheerios or something, caught it on fire. I mean, it was this whole thing to even find out. The bike shop owner that rents space at the bottom of the barn burner called me like, something's beeping. I get there, it's like smoke pouring out of the unit. I'm a silver linings person. So now I can say if I had to have an indoor fire, this is the kind I would have chosen. Because it was on the glass cooktop, it didn't spread. It was under a microwave. It destroyed the microwave, but the microwave didn't catch on fire. We had to wash all the linens like 5 times and get an ozone. It was all this, a whole big mess
Yep,
for
yep.
sure. But we just dealt with it and moved on. So that was definitely like the pinnacle of awfulness. I don't know what more else I could have done as a host to be prepared for that, because it's like, don't store food on the stove, I guess. I don't know.
Sure, yeah.
But
You put that on a list
yeah,
somewhere,
yeah,
or
yeah,
on a sticky note
yeah,
above the stove.
yeah. But in general, I mean, we've had great guests, and I just have the mindset of like, this is a hospitality business. It would be unreasonable of me to have the expectation that there's never a mess, or there's never something broken, or that there's never, little twists and turns to deal with, because that's literally the nature of the business. And so I just feel like you have to just go and, be prepared in the back of your mind that there's going to
Right.
be times where things come up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the advice that you gave earlier to folks who might be thinking about renting a home, whether it's, directly with the owner or going through a company like Airbnb or VRBO. I know there are other companies out there, booking.com, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not endorsing these
Yeah.
platforms, but, they
Yeah,
exist.
there's
So,
many options. Many options.
absolutely. And I just wanted to point out to our listeners that you said earlier that you do rent out the 4 spaces that you have individually as well through these organizations. So it's great that that's available,
Mhm.
as well. I would imagine on a limited basis, I understand, it's much
Yeah.
easier to book, the group who's going to have an event and,
Yeah.
all of that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
The calendar, you can only book the individual ones starting 90 days out if they're still available. So the majority of the groups we're hosting are larger groups with the whole space.
Absolutely. If you break something at an Airbnb, tell your host,
Yeah.
they are going to find out. That's wonderful advice. What other things would you love people to know coming in? Maybe someone that doesn't have a ton of experience renting homes or has yet to rent a home. What advice would you give someone like that?
You just rattled off all those different booking platforms. I get the sense from guests I interact with that people don't always understand how those platforms work. And sometimes it's to the benefit of the guest or the host to book with one of those platforms, and sometimes it's not. And so, again, it's a personal decision. Some people want all their reservations kept in one place. They want the assurance of having, if it's Airbnb or Vrbo or whoever, kind of like their helpline on call. But, the reason that they're providing all of that is because you're paying an additional fee to use those platforms. And so, our properties are listed on those types of platforms. I'm happy to host guests that book that way. But if you're open to booking directly, a lot of especially larger operations, like we do direct bookings, and you can save 14% or more on your booking costs. So it's actually a pretty sizable service fee that those platforms charge. And that's just, again, the nature of the game. I'm not begrudging them that. I appreciate that, that they're aggregating all these listings. But if the listing is using a particular name, like we're the Brown County Barn Burner, it says that in our listing. If you saw that and Googled it, you could find our website, and I have more flexibility with those kind of bookings. So I would just encourage people, like, understand what you're paying for to book on those
Mhm.
platforms. And if you're open to different terms or whatever would be required with booking directly, that you consider that. I think also, I would hope people do this already, but it's like really understanding what you're getting. For instance, we can host up to 29 people in our spaces. And I'm really clear about this, but I see plenty of listings that aren't. It's like that requires you're doubled up in king and queen beds, you're using sofa beds, you're da 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 da. It's like we host like small business teams that are doing like an executive retreat. Okay, you're not going to get 29 people with that layout. You're going to have 9 people maybe, because that's how many bedrooms we have, or there's 14 individual beds. So it's like that's obviously a big occupancy difference than 29. So just understanding what's required from the occupancy. Something I also look at is the like dining table setup, because part of why the Barn Burner is the way it is because we like to travel in large groups. So I'm like very familiar with what it takes to plan a large group trip. And I see so many listings, 14 people, and it's got a 6-person dining table and like 2 bar stools at the counter. And it's like, well, what are we all supposed to do?
Right.
We want to eat dinner together. So just looking at the layouts, understanding what you're getting. Is it one of those listings that I'll never understand that says they provide you with 1 roll of toilet paper and you have to bring your own with you? Make sure you're comparing apples to apples in that sense. Like, are you comparing the price of a full service, fully stocked location to a totally bare bones option? And there's all sorts of travelers. Some people are fine with the bare bones option. They would prefer that. That's fine. But if that's not you, like, don't add that another stress on your back of, oh, now here's another thing I have to pack.
Yeah, 100%. In my experience renting our Airbnbs, VRBOs, et cetera, is the listings are a lot of times very specific about what they include and more importantly, what they don't, so making sure you understand that ahead of time is an awesome thing. And, another thing that I do a lot when I'm renting Airbnbs, we typically travel with our 3 dogs. They're small dogs.
Yeah.
So, I will have a conversation with the host in the messages, side of the platform before I pull the trigger on anything, because I want to know, very specifically, well, first and foremost, is that allowed?
Right.
It says pet friendly or whatever it is, but 3 pets, is the backyard fenced in? These are things that are important to me, as a dog owner, someone who travels, with them. And, obviously, if you're a person that uses the bathroom, it's good to know
Yeah.
that you have more than 1 roll of toilet paper
Yeah. Yeah.
available to you. I love that. I read a great interview article with you in Authority magazine. It was really well done. And you talked a little bit about what you call the magic touches. What are these little touches that you personally add on to your hosting that's kind of your signature?
Something I've done a lot of thinking about lately. I mentioned we're coming into 5 years of having been hosted. And so I've spent a lot of time this year trying to look back and identify, what have I learned? What are things that have been on my list forever that I've been needing to implement? And there's kind of 2 things I've boiled it down to recently. And it's, at the end of the day, my goal for all of our guests is like, am I doing things that make it easier for them? So easier for them to get away, to find things in the space, just does it make sense for them? Does it make them feel welcome? Is the other one. And for me, that is, there's a lot of different ways that a guest might kind of interact with those 2 frameworks for me when they check in. It's everything from, like, on our beds, there's multiple weights of blankets. You've got like your duvet plus an extra. We've got ceiling fans, plus I just added little table side fans because I'd had multiple people mention that. And that to me is like the welcome piece. It's like, just because I think a ceiling fan should be enough, if more than one person says it would have been nice to have a little table side fan, it's like, then I should just be adding it. It's not that big of an expense. And sleep especially is like a critical component of a quality Airbnb stay or a hotel stay at all. And if that makes a difference, if one person has said it to me, probably 10 people have thought it. That's not scientific study or anything, but I just find most people, if it's in their mind, they're like, this isn't that big of a deal, they're just not going to mention it. So it's things like that, but it's also little things like, work with my cleaning team of little things like, when you're putting the coffee cups back on the shelves, like lining all the little handles up and stuff like that may seem tiny, but my personal opinion is that all those little touches of cleanliness, of orderliness, is something where I expect it to be. Like, those are kind of subconscious signals to the person in the unit of like, oh, like I can relax. This stay will actually be what I need it to be. Anything that's confusing or just dirty, especially, we don't want that. But I think people underestimate how much confusion messes with somebody when they're trying to figure out a space, and how that can really like taint your enjoyment of a stay.
Absolutely. And you mentioned hotel stays, and I think, what you're saying, is something that, the big Marriotts and Hyatts and all of that stuff as lodging options, have figured out. Disney, is another great
Yeah.
example of that. They have very specific things that they do to prepare their rooms for their
Mhm.
guests coming in, and everything is very uniform down to the coffee cups, handles facing the same way, and things like that. And I agree with you that I think as travelers, we underestimate or don't give enough significance to the fact that they are really putting the spit and polish on those things for you, so
Yeah.
you feel happy and comfortable when you walk into the space, because first impressions are everything, right?
Yeah.
So that little thing that you're walking into is, will have a big effect on the rest of your stay, moving forward 100%.
And again, I'll probably reference this more than once because I do think there's obviously all kinds of stays for all kinds of travelers. And at the Barn Burner, like we are providing a high level luxury stay, and there's going to be touches that I put priority on because that's the price point we're at and the traveler I'm trying to attract. If that's not the kind of stay you run or advertise, like that's fine. There's ways to do it that aren't as high touch, but I love Airbnbs. Like we mostly stay in short-term rental type stays versus hotels when we travel. But I do think there's this spectrum of like people think, oh, an Airbnb, it started out as an air mattress. It's a bed in your house. You're staying in someone's home. Like it being unique means it can't be welcoming and dialed into multiple types of guests. I think it goes too far into this. It's like a personal space, but a personal space isn't what's going to be intuitive to me as a stranger. And so that's the mindset switch that I think is important. It's that just because you have a unique space, even with all four of our units in the same building, everyone is unique. Like even despite these kind of consistent touches, you would not walk into one of the units and then go to another and think that it's a cookie cutter of one another. So we can still have plenty of personality and feel personal and welcoming while being able to work for multiple types of guests. I don't know if I'm quite explaining that right, but it's like just because there's a standard doesn't mean it's not a unique space and feels like a home sort of thing. Yeah, that's kind of the tension that can be hard to balance, but I think makes a big difference for the guests.
I've been to Airbnbs before that. I've had multiple spaces, and it's nice to have that contrast, between the different rooms, the different spaces, and so on. But also important to keep the quality, at the
Yeah.
same level, no matter what that is. What advice would you give to someone who was thinking about or wanted to turn their property into a rental space, Airbnb, event space, things like that?
Yeah, I think first off, you need to check with your local area and understand the regulations and what's actually allowed. My past life, I worked in like state and local government. And so I spent a lot of time understanding how ordinances are written and what they mean and, how they're applied then. And that was part of how we came up with the idea for the barn burner, is because there are restrictions here in Brown County for the max occupancy for most short-term rentals if they're zoned residential, but where the barn burner is its zoned business. So that allowed us to have the setup that we do and host more people like we do. But I see a lot of people that don't understand if there's an approval process, if, like I said, if there's occupancy limits, just what you're allowed to do in the area you're in. So that would be number one, is like make sure you're talking to planning and zoning or whoever handles that in your area to understand. But then I think maybe this perception is shifting, but maybe not, is that you used to just hear people talk about like owning an Airbnb and viewing it as this passive income source, which I personally don't really believe in, because if you're providing a quality experience and if you're the one managing it, and if you're not the one managing it, then it might not be the most quality experience. So I think they kind of go hand in hand. It is not passive. Like, yes, you have more flexibility. I can have a booking and not be in town. Obviously, I don't have to be there to greet and host guests, but there's still a lot that goes into that. And you're on call, somebody can have problem opening the door or have an issue with the AC at any time. And you're kind of the last one that's going to have to answer to that at the end of the day. So I think being realistic with yourself about like, are you actually willing to do what's needed to run a hospitality business, which is what an Airbnb is at the end of the day.
You're essentially a landlord,
Right.
a short-term landlord,
Right.
so
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
have
You've got
to.
the hardest part. You have no wiggle room. And, I mean, you're able to charge more, yes, than a long-term rental, but there's like much more hands-on management required. And any issue needs a much faster resolution than any long-term tenant would expect.
I'm just thinking back to my time in the
Yeah.
business and, water heaters going out, an hour before, the wedding rehearsal is supposed to start and everyone's trying to shower. And that's a thing, that's
Yep.
something that has to be fixed, right
Right.
away. How do you do that? Do you have a plumber on call that, are you a plumber?
Yeah.
These are little things that we absolutely need to think about, as lodging rental owners, so definitely keep those things in mind if you are considering going into that business. You've stayed, as you've said, at plenty of Airbnb, type places. What do you look for you and your family when you book a getaway?
So beyond kind of the things I mentioned earlier, does the bedroom and bed layout actually work for the group we have, the dining area, the outdoor area? I like places that have a uniqueness and like a sense of place to where they're located. So, I like to be able to get a sense of the area, like based on the decor and the way it's furnished and the activities that are available. So, for example, last November, I went on a solo trip to Mexico and like I stayed in an Airbnb that had like art and culture from the area that I was able, it gave me a sense of the place I was in. And that's something that matters to me. I find travel to be really inspiring and I like design, I like architecture. And so not necessarily like a place that's crazy luxury, like high end. To me, it's more about just, I don't know, it's just like a vibe and a feel of the place that it's obviously well cared for. It's been decorated in a way that makes sense where it's at. And again, it just really depends who we're traveling with. If we're with our daughters or with family, I'm going to be looking for proximity to activities that make sense for them or things that are stocked in the house that are going to make it easier to enjoy that stay. Where if it's myself and my husband, then our needs are a little more bare bones.
Yeah, having a wish list, ahead of time, understanding what's going to make you the most comfortable and the most uncomfortable,
Yeah.
So taking those things, you probably don't want to book that condo in downtown San Diego if you're looking for, a nice, intimate, retreat for you and, your small family, things like that, so these are things you want to think about.
And something kind of in line with what you mentioned earlier about how if there's something really important to you, like you traveling with your dogs, like message the host in advance and confirm that thing. A lot of times, especially if you're like booking on a platform, it may not show. One thing that will oftentimes matter to me is like, where is this actually located compared to what am I wanting to do? So whether it's I want to be in a walkable area or we know we're going to this state park or something and the only entrance is here, like I don't want to stay somewhere that's 40 minutes away from that if I know that's a really important activity. And it's not always easy or accurate on some of those platforms to truly know where something is located, and that's for safety reasons. Like I understand all that, but if you know that that's important to you, message the host in advance and say, how far away is this from X, Y, or Z? Or how easy is it to walk? Or is it close to a subway station? I mean, oftentimes this will be in the listings, but it's easy to you hope people are honest and accurate in their listings, but sometimes you'll see some and you'll be like, 15 minutes from X, that's a stretch. I know where this is and that's a stretch. And so asking people to just confirm that can, save you a lot of headache in the long run.
Yeah, definitely. As I pointed out earlier, using that message section of that particular platform that you're using has been uber helpful to me, getting questions asked, talking about proximity to places, is it walkable? I love all of those questions and those can be easily answered in those places. So
Yeah.
Definitely want to utilize those when you're booking.
Yeah.
All right, let's switch things up a little bit.
Yeah.
You mentioned wineries earlier, and of course, I would be remiss as the wine
Yeah.
guy,
Yeah.
to not talk about some of the great things that are happening in the state of Indiana when it comes to wine. What are some of your local favorites?
It is a tourist area, so we have several wineries and tasting rooms here in the area. There's two wineries that actually, do their production here in Brown County. One is called the Brown County Winery, which, you could have predicted that. And there's a newer one that just opened last year called Range 46. So both of them are producing here in county and have, their production facility you can visit and a tasting room. And the Brown County Winery actually has a second tasting room in town. And then there are other wineries just like in the state of Indiana. Some of them are pretty close to Brown County, but aren't actually producing here that have tasting rooms here as well. And so it's fun. Most of them have free tastings or it's $5 or something like that. And if you buy a bottle, then the $5 gets taken off. So it's actually a really fun way to walk around town. There's 4 tasting rooms in town. So you might be hard pressed to do all 4 in one day just for, being able to walk from one to the other after you're done. But you could do it or pick a weekend and do 1 or 2 a day. And I think most people would, if you were familiar with Southern Indiana wines, like there's definitely a range and some of it goes more towards sweet or using other fruits like blackberry or strawberry, like not Boone's Farm level. I mean, not to throw shade at any particular brand, but alternate fruits, because that is I would say kind of a Southern Indiana, like hills of whatever tradition, but they're also using more traditional grapes and making dry reds and a whole spectrum. And so that's why the tastings can be nice. You'd be surprised at how good some of them are and affordable as well. So
Here in California, of course, we make wine in California.
yeah.
That's what California does, right?
Yeah.
But the more I dig into winemaking around the states, the more fascinated I get. And I just want to keep diving in. Wine in Kentucky, wine in Virginia, wine in Hawaii, of course, Oregon and Washington as well. I had a great conversation with someone recently in New York and above the border in Canada as well. I've got an episode coming out, or it actually would have come out by the time this airs, about Canadian wine, Southern Ontario wine. We just don't know they exist, and it's so much fun to explore. Of course, I can't thank you enough, Kara, for being on the show today and, really shining a spotlight on not only what you're doing, but this beautiful area that you're in. There's so much to do, so much to see, and I think it would be really a lot of fun to, get out there and explore Brown County, Indiana.
Yeah, I should have mentioned this earlier when you were asking me about the area, but anybody who's watching, if you see the photos behind me, my criteria for the art I collect for this room is that it's original, it's less than $25, and there's a couple exceptions to that. But the biggest one is that it has to look like it could be from Brown County. So some of it is, I collect stuff on trips and all other kind of places that isn't necessarily from here, but the subject matter could be a place in Brown County. So like this is the vibe of the area. And if that appeals to you, then you definitely should come and visit.
I mean, covered bridges and tree-lined dirt roads, and it looks absolutely gorgeous. And I can't wait to get there. Kara, thank you so much for your time today. I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
What a super fun conversation with Kara. I don't know about you, but I'm very tempted to pack a bag, grab some friends, and book a weekend at the Barn Burner. If only I wasn't 3,000 miles away. Here's what I loved most about Kara's story. It's not just about renting a cool space. It's about building connection. And that, at the end of the day, is what this show is all about. Building that connection through travel, food, wine, stories, and just amazing things. And I'm so glad I could have her on the show. When it comes to hospitality and the rental space, it's a welcome basket. It's a fan in every room. It's a quick response when something goes sideways. Kara brings heart and hospitality to everything she does. And let's not forget, Brown County, Indiana is not what you think. Wineries, art galleries, charming hiking trails, a town called Nashville, which is just as fun as the one that you're thinking of, and apparently some of the most group-friendly rentals around. If you're looking for a unique travel spot that's a little off the beaten path, but one big on charm, you definitely want to look her up. You're going to find Kara's details in the show notes, and please go check her out. Follow them on social media. They've got a lot of cool stuff going on. Speaking of which, you also want to follow me on social media if you're not doing that already. And if you're loving what you're hearing right now, please, please, please hit like, hit subscribe, leave me a review. And if you have a fascinating story that you'd love to share on Pour and Explore, reach out to me, shoot me a message, shoot me an email, and I would love to chat with you. So until next time, friends, keep wondering and wandering. Cheers to you, take care, and we will see you next time.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Pour and Explore. I'd love to hear your thoughts, your stories, and your questions, so you can drop me a line at cheers@thewineguy.vin. That's cheers@thewineguy.vin. Or let's connect on TikTok, Instagram, or Facebook. Grab those links on my website at thewineguy.vin. Until next time, let's keep wondering and wandering. Cheers, everyone.